Hello, thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it one more minute for people to arrive and then we'll start with today's press conference. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Tarana Hassan. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at Human Rights Watch and I'll be moderating today's event. Welcome to the press conference for our report, A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. I would like to start proceedings today by introducing you to our panelists. We are joined today by Ken Roth, Human Rights Watch's Executive Director, Eric Goldstein, our Acting Middle East North Africa Director, Omar Shaker, Israel Palestine Director, and Sari Bashi, the current Research Director at Democracy for the Arab World Now, and a Special Advisor to Human Rights Watch on this report. By way of proceedings today, our panelists will be happy to answer questions at the end of the panel presentation. And you have the option, of course, of writing your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. I would like to remind everybody that today's Q&A portion is for working journalists only. And so if you could both identify yourself by name and also your outlet, that would be appreciated. But to start us off, I'd like to hand over to Ken.
Okay, thank you, Tarana, and hello, everyone. It saddens us to have to write this report. We never like to spotlight serious crimes because they speak to serious suffering. People whose lives have been upended or impeded because of how they're treated, or in this case, because of who they are. We're aware that in anything said in the context of Israel and Palestine inflames passions. But as in all cases, we scrupulously apply our methodology. We find the facts as carefully and objectively as possible. We apply the standards of international human rights and humanitarian law. We report on the most serious abuses by all sides in any conflict. In this case, not only the Israeli government, but also the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And that, of course, includes suicide bombing attacks on Israeli civilians and Hamas rocket attacks on Israeli towns. We also ensure that we give regular, serious attention to Israel's neighbors, many of whom themselves are responsible for severe human rights abuses. And we tried to engage with the Israeli government in advance of the report, as we always do. We wrote to Prime Minister Netanyahu last July, giving the government 11 specific issues and requesting a meeting to discuss them, but the government never responded. That letter is actually an appendix to this report. Just this last week, we sent an executive summary of the report to the Prime Minister's office, and again, heard nothing back. Now, in this case, as you will hear, the Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of persecution and apartheid. We realize that these words make people uncomfortable. We're not using them for historical comparison purposes, but because they are the terms of international criminal law as defined in widely ratified treaties. They are how international law characterizes what is happening today. Now, we recognize that we are not the first to use these terms. Several of our colleague organizations in Israel and Palestine have already made similar findings. But we hope to make a significant contribution to this issue with the depth of our research and the detail of our legal analysis. Now, even mainstream publications have been using the term apartheid for some time now, but in a conditional way. They tend to say, if Israel continues down this path, if the Israeli government proceeds in this manner, it will become the crime of apartheid. We say that it's time to recognize reality. It's time to recognize that that time is already here, that the crime of apartheid is already being committed. Admitting that reality is important because it speaks to the depth of the suffering imposed on so many Palestinians. Now, many people have averted their eyes from this reality in the hope that the peace process will somehow solve the problem. We all would love to see a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we shouldn't be kidding ourselves. This protracted process does not justify an intolerable status quo. After nearly 54 years of occupation, after 30 years of a peace process, we cannot ignore the ugly reality today. The Israeli government is committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Those crimes must stop, regardless of some future political settlement that may or may not ever come. Hope that someday peace will arrive does not justify severe human rights violations today. The Human Rights Watch is compelled to conclude that the crimes of apartheid and persecution are being committed is because they are. We wish that were not true, but it is. Admitting that difficult truth is an essential first step toward bringing it to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'd now like to hand over to Eric Goldstein, who will provide some historical context.
Thank you, and good morning from Washington, D.C. In a minute, my colleague Omar Shaker will walk you through the report. 3 decades ago, I had Omar's job. I helped produce reports on many of the same violations that Israeli authorities are committing today: administrative detentions, home demolitions, sweeping restrictions on the right to freedom of movement. Things were bad, but seriously, we never had internal discussions about whether in the 1990s, Israeli authorities were committing the crime of apartheid or persecution. One reason was that the crime of apartheid requires proving an intent to maintain a system of domination that favors one group over another group. In those days, there was the Oslo peace process, an incipient Palestinian Authority, and at least hope for a breakthrough that would ease the repression. That hope prompted many to downplay the scale of the abuses. Policymakers treated them as regrettable symptoms of the absence of peace. If the negotiations bear fruit, they said, the abuses will subside. Such an approach has lost whatever credibility it may once have had. While peace talks went nowhere, the situation grew more entrenched, while Israeli leaders made clear their intention to hold on to most or all of the West Bank forever. Discrimination based on whether you are a Palestinian or an Israeli Jew permeates all aspects of life. A Jewish Israeli can live their entire life abroad and plan to retire in Jerusalem without even thinking twice. A Palestinian born in that city who goes overseas to get a doctorate lives in fear of losing their residency status. The number of Jews living in West Bank settlements has more than doubled since the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. Settlements are not only illegal, they dramatize the systematic discrimination between Jews and Palestinians who live side by side. Settlers fill their swimming pools with subsidized water, while their Palestinian neighbors scramble to buy water off the back of trucks. Israeli citizens zip past checkpoints inside the West Bank, where Palestinians can be delayed for hours or turned back without an explanation. While some of the repressive Israeli policies are rooted in real security concerns, they are implemented in a way that makes no effort to balance these objectives against the rights of those that they harm. Other policies have little credible security justification and seek to maximize control over land or ensured demographic domination. Omar is going to provide you with some illustrations. 2 years ago, we decided, Human Rights Watch, instead of doing yet another report on, say, home demolitions, to connect the dots of all the work that we and other groups have been doing for over 3 decades and capture in human rights terms what it means to be a Palestinian living under Israel's authority, whether you're a professor in Ramallah or a fisherman in Gaza. Human Rights Watch, Human Rights has a vocabulary for this, one that will help people see the big picture. And whatever people's preferred vision may be for Israeli-Palestinian peace, or whoever they blame for the lack of progress so far, will put the focus on ending a system that is designed to give one people superior rights and another people inferior rights. Omar will walk you through our findings now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now I'd like to hand over to Omar Shaker, who's also the principal author of this report, to discuss the findings. So, Omar.
Thank you, Tarana. This 213-page report, more than 2 years in the making, evaluates Israel's treatment of Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. It is based on years of Human Rights Watch documentation, review of government statements, planning documents, as well as case studies conducted for this report. It evaluates the facts we documented against established law on discrimination, including a universal prohibition on severe discriminatory oppression or apartheid. While originally coined in relation to South Africa, apartheid is today a universal legal term defined in several international treaties and indeed a crime against humanity set out not only in the 1973 Convention specifically on apartheid, but also in the 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. As a crime, apartheid refers to an intent by one racial group to dominate another. Second, systematic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. And third, particularly grave abuses known as inhumane acts. International human rights law defines racial group to include distinctions based on ethnicity, national origin, among other categories. There's also the crime against humanity of persecution, defined under the Rome Statute and customary international law to refer to discriminatory intent when leading to severe abuses of fundamental rights. On the basis of our research and these definitions, Human Rights Watch concludes that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Human Rights Watch found that the elements of the crimes come together in the occupied territory pursuant to a single Israeli government policy. That policy is to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. In the occupied territory, that intent and policy is combined with inhumane acts and systematic oppression committed against Palestinians living there. On the intent part of the analysis, Human Rights Watch found, based on its research, that Israeli authorities have pursued an intent to maintain domination by seeking to maintain control over demographics and land. Israeli policies have long sought to justify restrictions against Palestinians by justifying them as necessitated by the demographic threats that Palestinians pose. For example, in 2003, Israeli authorities passed a law effectively prohibiting the granting of long-term legal status to Palestinians in the occupied territory married to Israeli citizens and nationals. When it comes to land, Israeli policies across Israel and the occupied territory have sought to maximize land for Jewish Israeli communities and hem in Palestinian areas. Inside Israel proper, these policies can be seen most dramatically in the Negev and in the Galilee, areas where the government has set out a formal policy to Judaize these areas that make up 2/3 of the land inside Israel. Within the Negev, for example, Israeli authorities have refused to legally recognize 35 Palestinian Bedouin communities, meaning that their 90,000 residents effectively live illegally in their own homes, not connected to electricity and water grids, and constantly fearing the prospect of demolitions. Inside the municipality of Jerusalem, which encompasses both occupied east and west parts of the city, Israeli authorities have set a goal to maintain a solid Jewish majority in the city and to, quote, pursue densification and thickening of Palestinian neighborhoods. They've even set target demographic ratios they hope to maintain between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Inside the Gaza Strip, Israeli authorities have pursued a policy of separation. Their enforcement of this policy has translated into a dynamic where Israeli authorities effectively forbid Gaza residents from moving to the West Bank as part of a strategy to consolidate a Jewish majority across Israel and the remainder of the occupied territory, in essence, gerrymandering a Jewish majority across these areas. And of course, in the West Bank, Israeli government plans, such as the 1980s Drobel's plans, are very explicit in calling for authorities to, quote, settle the land between the minority population centers and their surroundings, noting that doing so would remove any trace of doubt about our intention to control Judea and Samaria forever, terms that refer to the West Bank. Israeli authorities have removed any trace of doubt through their massive land grabs and significant investment in infrastructure connecting settlements to Israel proper. These policies amount to discriminatory intent, one of the prongs of persecution, and to an intent to dominate, one of the prongs of apartheid. Pursuant to this intent, Israeli authorities have erected a two-tier system. This report shows that Israeli authorities rule primarily over the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, where Jewish Israelis and Palestinians live in roughly equal number, and where they pursued a policy to methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and repress Palestinians at various degrees of intensity. In the occupied Palestinian territory, the means amount to systematic oppression, the second prong of apartheid. These means include the following. In the West Bank, Israeli authorities have subjected for 54 years Palestinians to draconian military rule, while applying Israeli civil law to Jewish Israeli settlers living in illegal settlements in the same territory. The application of this dual body of law means that in the very same area, a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian who commit the same crime are tried in different courts where they will receive different sentences and have entirely different processes. Most dramatically, as we speak today, 400 Palestinians are being held in administrative detention without trial or charge based on secret evidence. 0 Jewish Israelis are being held in administrative detention. In the West Bank, Israeli authorities enforce segregation, barring Palestinians from entering settlements built on confiscated Palestinian land, except as laborers bearing special permits. In addition, in the West Bank, Israeli authorities have plundered the land and resources of Palestinians and then reallocated it in a discriminatory fashion, favoring Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank. In East Jerusalem, which Israel considers part of its sovereign territory, but remains occupied territory under international law, similar discriminatory dynamics prevail. Take, for example, the area of Kufr Aqab, one of the case studies in this report. In 2002, Israeli authorities built the separation barrier to separate this Palestinian area from the rest of Jerusalem. And then they effectively stopped governing in this area, refusing to regulate construction, to provide basic services, and effectively turning Kufr Aqab into an overcrowded slum. And one of the reasons why Kufr Aqab is an overcrowded slum is it's one of the few areas where mixed marriage Palestinian couples can live. A West Bank ID holder and a Jerusalem ID holder can both legally be present together. And of course, in the Gaza Strip, Israeli authorities have for more than 14 years enforced a generalized travel ban, robbing 2 million Palestinians of their right to free movement outside of narrow humanitarian exemptions. They've also severely restricted the entry and exit of goods. Today, 80% of Gaza's population relies on humanitarian aid, and most families spend most of their day without electricity. Israel, of course, has legitimate security concerns, but many of these abuses at the heart of apartheid and persecution, land grabs, residency revocations, denials of building permit, have no security justification or use security as mere pretext to advance demographic goals. And even where security is a consideration, Israeli authorities have pursued a strategy of domination, which no more justifies apartheid and persecution than it would torture or indiscriminate attacks. Thirdly, amid this context of systematic oppression, Israeli authorities have carried out a range of abuses against Palestinians. We found 5 clusters of particularly grave abuses in the occupied Palestinian territory that rise to the threshold of inhumane acts and severe abuses of fundamental rights, the third prong of apartheid. The first of these 5 inhumane acts are the sweeping movement restrictions. Not only the aforementioned closure of Gaza, but the imposition of a permit regime requiring Palestinians to obtain difficult to obtain permits to enter large swaths of the West Bank. It includes the erection of nearly 600 checkpoints and other closure barriers that can turn a short commute into an hours-long humiliating ordeal. And it includes the building of the separation barrier in large part on Palestinian land, separating farmers from the agricultural land, separating families from basic services in their communities. Secondly, the second inhumane act Human Rights Watch documents is the mass expropriation of Palestinian land. More than 2,000 square kilometers, or 500,000 acres, more than 1/3 of the West Bank, dispossessing thousands of families. Of the more than 675 square kilometers, 1,000 acres of public land allocated by the Israeli government for public use, Israeli authorities have allocated more than 99% to Israeli civilians. And these land grabs have reduced Palestinians to living in dozens of disconnected enclaves. Third, coercive policies that make it effectively impossible for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to build homes and schools in East Jerusalem and the majority of the West Bank under Israel's exclusive control in order to coerce them to leave areas they covered for Jewish settlement. This is known as forcible transfer under international law. Between 2016 and 2018, Israeli authorities issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians in Area C. Thousands of homes, schools, and other structures have been demolished, upending lives. As we speak today, 46 Palestinian communities in the West Bank are at high risk of demolition, according to the United Nations. Fourth, the denial of residency rights to Palestinians in the occupied territory. Israeli authorities have stripped more than 500,000 Palestinians of their right to residence in the occupied territory because they were abroad too long. They weren't there at the right time. And they've effectively frozen the process of family reunification since 2000, separating families for no other reason than who they are. Fifth and finally, Human Rights Watch finds that the mass suspension of civil rights for 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the suspension of the right to free expression, assembly, association, or any say over the government that rules over them is an inhumane act that meets the threshold of apartheid. Based on these findings, Human Rights Watch calls on Israeli authorities to end apartheid and persecution and dismantle all forms of discrimination and repression that privilege Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians, including with regards to freedom of movement, building permits, allocation of land, resources, water, electricity, and other services. These are the most stark findings Human Rights Watch has ever reached on the conduct of Israeli authorities in the more than 3 decades we've been documenting abuses on the ground. Based on these grave findings, we call on the international community to take a range of steps in line with where we found crimes against humanity in other contexts. All these recommendations aim to end complicity in the crimes. They include recognition of the crimes and statements to that effect, a UN Commission of Inquiry to look into discrimination based on group identity in Israel and the occupied territory, and a global envoy with a mandate to seek the end of apartheid and persecution in every corner of the earth where it may be today. Thirdly, for the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute those Israeli officials implicated in the crimes, as well as for national courts to do so under the principle of universal jurisdiction and in accordance with national law. Fourth, targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans against those Israeli officials implicated in the crime. And fifth and finally, conditioning arms sales and military and security assistance to Israel on Israeli authorities taking steps to end apartheid and persecution. These asks boil down to the following, which is where I will conclude. A 54-year occupation is not temporary. A 30-year stalled peace process isn't sufficient on its own to dismantle systematic repression. Denying millions of Palestinians their fundamental rights solely because they are Palestinian and not Jewish Israeli is not simply a matter of abusive occupation. The first step to solving any problem is to accurately diagnose it. Apartheid is no longer a hypothetical. It is no longer a future scenario. The threshold has been crossed. It is the present day reality for millions of Palestinians. Those who strive for Israeli-Palestinian peace, whether in a one-state solution, a two-state solution, or a confederation, should recognize this reality for what it is and bring to bear the sorts of human rights tools needed to end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Our final panelist today is Sari Bashi. Sari is the research director at Dawn, the former executive director of Gisha, and a special advisor at Human Rights Watch on this report. So Sari.
Thank you, Tarana. In publishing this report, Human Rights Watch is honored to follow the lead of Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations whose on-the-ground research and analysis have long pointed to systemic and severe institutional discrimination. Already a decade ago, Palestinian rights groups like Al-Haq and PCHR determined that apartheid and persecution are being committed. And in the last year, the Israeli groups Yesh Din and B'Tselem made similar findings. Palestinians have known for years that this is apartheid, and Israelis are starting to realize it too. A public opinion poll published this month found that 28% of Israelis, 41% of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and 25% of Israeli Jews believe that the term apartheid fits the situation here, either somewhat or very much. 77% of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank think the term fits. When apartheid is being committed, you don't get to choose your place in the racial hierarchy. 68 years ago, my father fled to Israel, and the Israeli authorities classified him as Jewish in the population registry. He's also Arab, born in Iraq to Arabic-speaking parents. They granted him the rights and privileges reserved for Jews, and I inherited that status from him. So I can get a COVID vaccine, while Palestinians my age in Gaza and the West Bank cannot. I can travel freely, while Palestinians are confined to enclaves. I can choose my place of residence in towns that the Israeli government builds for Jews, while the Israeli authorities demolish Palestinian homes, choke the development of Palestinian towns, and exclude Palestinians from Jewish-only communities. This is not the system I want. It's not the system that many Israeli Jews want. And as you can imagine, it's not the system Palestinians want. Human Rights Watch is asking governments and businesses to end their complicity in these crimes. And we're asking the Israeli government to make them stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sari. So that concludes the presentations from our panelists. We're now opening up to questions. Just a reminder, the question and answer portion of today's press conference is obviously for journalists. So if you do have a question, we do ask that you identify yourself and your outlet before posing your question. And we have two options for you. You can either place your question at the box at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. So we have our first question from Wafa Abdul Rahman. So Wafa, if I hand over to you.
Yes, yes. First, thank you very much. My name is Wafa Abdurrahman. I'm director of Palestiniyat. It's a media organization, and I'm chief editor of Nawa. It's a feminist news agency. I have two questions, but before that, as a Palestinian, I want to say thank you. At least when I was listening to the different interventions, I would say a little bit that I felt little justice has been served for Palestinians. The recognition of the situation is very important to us. And to come from an organization like the Human Rights Watch, this is a big thing, honestly. So thank you, thank you, thank you. My first question is, all through the reports of the Human Rights Watch, the standard, the methodology was the international law. Why now? Why now you decided to come with this big report and with all those facts? Why now? I'm still not getting it. This is my first question, and I'm very passionate about it. I'm sorry, I think I'm losing the second question, but I will write it down, but I need to, yeah, the second question is concerning the anti-Semitism. And of course, this is the first thing that you will be accused of. Are you prepared to counter the attack that has been already, or has started already, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Omar, if I just pass to you to answer Wafa's question.
Sure, and it's great to hear from you, Wafa, and thank you for the kind words. Human Rights Watch does not make determinations about crimes against humanity lightly. While certainly many of the abuses documented in the report are long-standing, there was some debate for some time about whether or not Israeli authorities had an intent to dominate. For much of the 1990s and 2000s, there was a sense that this could be a situation that a political process could soon lead to a different outcome. But recent years have erased any shred of doubt about the intention of Israeli authorities. And I would point to several significant developments. First is the mass expansion of land grabs, as well as the infrastructure connecting settlements to Israel proper, reinforcing the idea of permanence. Secondly, while Israeli authorities for years in court submissions to the Israeli High Court, as well as in public statements, talked about the situation as temporary, as pending an outcome of a political process, that fig leaf has been dropped. Israeli authorities directly speak now of their intent to rule over the West Bank in perpetuity. In addition, when you add to that the reality on the ground where laws are being passed that directly apply to West Bank settlements, so to Jewish Israelis living in one territory, but not to Palestinians, providing them rights protections denied to Palestinians. When you put all these factors together, and when you have laws and statements making clear the status of Jewish Israelis heightened and deserving of more protection under the law, it became clear that an intent to dominate is present. The evidence was overwhelming, so when we finished the research and we applied the law, we reached this determination.
Thank you, Omar. For the second part of Wafa's question, was there... Ken, would you like to take that?
Shall I answer it, Tirana?
Sure, thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Wafa, for your question about anti-Semitism. We know that people who don't like to see Israel criticized often use the accusation of anti-Semitism. We make very clear in this report that the crime of apartheid is committed by individuals in the Israeli Authority. It is not an accusation against the Israeli people, and it is certainly not an accusation against Jews. Secondly, the accusation is made that we focus excessively on Israel. This is absolutely false. We have, our record of coverage, as my colleague Ken Roth has said, of all of Israel's neighbors. We've also called the situation in Myanmar just last year one of apartheid, practiced against the Rohingya people. Just last week, we accused Chinese authorities of practicing the crime against humanity of persecution against the Muslim Xinjiang population. So the accusation that we focus on one country is patently false.
Thank you, Eric. Our next question is actually from the chat, from Han Fogel, from Danish Radio, who's asking, has something changed in the way Human Rights Watch and international law use the definition of apartheid, formerly reserved for the political situation in South Africa? And if yes, why? And when did this change happen? Omar, would you like to take this?
Thank you, Tarana, and thank you for the thoughtful question. Absolutely. I think the experience of what happened in South Africa led the international community to decide that they do not want to see this sort of practice happen anywhere else in the world. So, of course, apartheid, you begin to see elements of it in the law from the 1960s, including its incorporation in the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In 1973, the international community came together and passed a convention on the practice of apartheid. But a really significant step in the development of the law around apartheid was the 1998 Rome Statute, which lists apartheid as one of the 11 crimes against humanity it identifies. This happened years after the end of apartheid in South Africa and makes clear that the international community sought to create apartheid as a universal crime against humanity. Apartheid has not extensively been litigated in courts. There has been a growing body of scholarship around it. And Human Rights Watch applies apartheid and persecution, crimes of the exact same gravity under international law, just as we apply crimes against humanity everywhere else in the world where we work and we reach those determinations.
Thank you, Omar. We have a couple of questions actually in the chat box, which I'll just surmise from Pete Singer from the Media and Entertainment Arts Alliance. He is asking, how does Human Rights Watch see the balance between the security concerns and the rights of people living under Israeli control? I'm surmising there, but Omar, will I go back to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Tarana. I mean, our standards for how you balance security and human rights are what's set out in international human rights law. Let's take the example of Gaza. Israel certainly would have a right to restrict the entry of people into its own sovereign territory based on an individualized security assessment if they felt that that person posed a security threat, right? But what's happening in Gaza now is a generalized ban on the travel of all people outside of humanitarian condition, except for humanitarian conditions. So irrespective of your individualized security profile, that goes far beyond what international law offers. Another example would be civil rights, which we talked about among the inhumane acts. Certainly a government and certainly an occupying power, can take steps to ensure that it mitigates security threats. But when you issue draconian military orders that impose 10-year jail sentence on Palestinians who do not have a permit for a peaceful protest, that goes far beyond, what the law offers. So this report is clear that we're applying the exact same standards in how we weigh security and human rights as we do everywhere else in the world. And I think it's important to, again, reiterate that the majority of the inhumane acts we document in the occupied territory, land grabs, permit denials, home demolitions, Israel doesn't even offer a security justification. And where it does, for example, the freezing of the population registry, it is very clearly pretextual and has been challenged by Israeli human rights groups all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court.
Thank you, Omar. Our next question is coming from Toby Burns with NHK Japan. And he's asking, why are you stressing the designation of apartheid now? Did these crimes and behaviors get worse during the Trump administration? And did something change with the annexation threat and then the normalization of diplomatic relations within the region? And can you put a bit more context? Ken, would you like to start us off on this one?
Sure. The normalization of relations had nothing to do with this. It was true that there were certain statements by the Netanyahu government, such as the intent to annex, even though it didn't carry through with that, was part of the kind of broader pattern that Omar outlined which were indicative of an intent to maintain domination of one group over another. So I think we've seen this trend continue. But frankly, why now versus a year ago or 2 years ago? I mean, we don't in this report attempt to say, when did it start? But there really are two factors which Ricky outlined earlier. One is that up until now, we really had been focusing on one kind of abuse after another kind of abuse. So, it could be abuses by Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, but with respect to the Israeli government, we would look at the settlements, or we would look at detention. We would look at a sort of categories of abuses in isolation. And what we did with this report is to put it all together. And that pattern really spoke starkly to the existence of apartheid and persecution. The other factor, frankly, is that, for many years, we kind of accepted that this was temporary, that the peace process was real, that this would somehow, come to an end within the foreseeable future. And that's just not credible anymore. As I said, we all hope that the peace process works, but 30 years into it, with no end in sight, we can't accept that, remote prospect as justifying a contemporary abusive reality. And so we essentially said, we're not going to accept this, supposed temporariness because of the peace process. We're going to look at what it is. If the peace process comes to fruition, great. But in the meantime, we're going to look at what it is today, and we're going to say, it's not acceptable to tolerate these abuses today in the name of some potential future development. And when you look at what's there today, it's apartheid and persecution.
Thank you, Ken. We have another question from Ian Williams. So only this week, the UK Labour leader cancelled a speaker at an interfaith Ramadan service for supporting BDS. As one of the few ways the international community can exert influence on Israel, based on the South African example, can Human Rights Watch help legitimize BDS activities and thwart attempts to make them illegal in the US and Western Europe? Omar, would you like to take this one?
Human Rights Watch has never called for a boycott of Israel, and this report does not call for a boycott of Israel. Our recommendations stem from the same principle that underlies our work wherever we find grave abuses, which is to end complicity in the crime. That ask is made of rights bearers, governments, businesses, other entities similarly situated. We don't make calls to consumers. And our calls are based on them respecting their international human rights obligations. It's not part of a broader political program. That said, Human Rights Watch has been clear that all people have the right to free expression, whether to oppose or support boycotts, but that's not what this report is about. This report is based on our factual assessment of the reality on the ground today, applying the law and issuing recommendations that are aimed at ending complicity in the crimes.
Thank you, Omar. I do see that Ian has his hand up. So do you have a follow-up question, Ian?
It was just many years. I was a veteran of the South African apartheid campaign, so it's quite close. And the question of boycott and sanctions and showing the disapproval of the international community for South Africa was, I think, important in the ending of apartheid. And I think that at the moment, Israeli society suffers no consequences from what their government does. An international campaign on the lines of BDS is perfectly legitimate, especially with boycotts of settlement produce, which we're not talking about boycotting Israel per se, boycotting settlement produce is quite enough. And that is being made illegal in many countries. And it's almost a human rights watch issue. The people who advocate this are being persecuted, deprived of jobs, and pilloried across Western Europe.
Ken, I think, was just going to come in here.
Yeah, Ian, let me just say, as Omar mentioned, we do uphold the right of people to peacefully advocate, and including advocating for boycotts. That's not what we're doing in this report, though. And in this report, we are very explicitly not targeting the Israeli people. This is not a call to boycott, individuals or society or Israel as a whole. Our recommendations are very much aimed at avoiding complicity. So we say, governments should make sure that their military aid or their arms sales, are not used in committing this crime. We're saying that, anybody who does business with the Israeli settlements are helping what are clear violations of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the prohibition on forcible transfer of an occupied nation's population into occupied territory. But we take this very narrow complicity approach. We're not urging a broad boycott. We're not engaging in broader political aims of the BDS movement. It's fine for people to advocate that, but that's not what we do with this report.
Thanks very much, Ken. We actually have no more questions, so we'll give it just one more moment if you'd like to either put your hand up or put a question in the chat. Okay, so, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our panelists, Omar Shaker, Sari Bashi, Ken Roth, and Eric Goldstein. We will now conclude today's press conference. The details, contact details for follow-up interviews will be available on the screen after this. Thank you very much for your attendance and your interest in our report. Have a nice day.